What happens when one of the world's biggest superstars sits down for what should be a routine interview, only to find herself in the crosshairs of controversial questions that push every button? Today, we're diving into the explosive moment that had everyone talking when Beyoncé found herself face to face with Joy Behar on The View. And what started as promotion for her latest project quickly spiraled into television chaos. If you want to see how this unfolds and hear every word that was exchanged, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story has twists you won't see coming. The studio lights were blazing as Beyoncé settled into her chair on The View, the familiar energy of daytime television surrounding her. She had done countless interviews before, navigating everything from personal questions to industry drama with the grace that made her a global icon. Today was supposed to be different, though. A chance to discuss her latest creative ventures and connect with the audience that had supported her for decades. Joy Behar leaned forward in her chair, her expression already carrying that familiar spark that longtime viewers knew meant she was ready to dig deeper than surface-level pleasantries. "Beyoncé, it's wonderful to have you here," she began, her voice carrying warmth, but with an undertone that suggested this wasn't going to be your typical celebrity chat. "I have to say, your influence on music and culture has been undeniable. But there's something I've been curious about." Beyoncé smiled graciously, her posture confident but relaxed. "Thank you for having me, Joy. I'm excited to be here and talk about the music." "Well, that's just it," Joy continued, her tone shifting slightly. "Your music has always carried these messages about empowerment, about lifting women up, about social justice. But I'm wondering, do you ever feel like you're preaching to the choir, like the people who need to hear these messages the most are the ones who aren't listening to your music anyway?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and viewers could see Beyoncé processing it. Her smile remained, but there was a subtle shift in her energy. "I think music has a way of reaching people in ways we don't always expect," she replied diplomatically. "When I create, I'm not thinking about who might not be listening. I'm focused on connecting with the people who are ready to receive the message." Joy nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't satisfied with that response. "Right, but let's be honest here. Your concerts, your albums, they come with a pretty hefty price tag. How do you reconcile talking about equality and social justice when your music is essentially luxury entertainment that a lot of working-class people can't afford?" The other hosts exchanged glances, sensing the temperature in the room beginning to rise. Beyoncé's posture straightened slightly, her professional demeanor intact, but with an edge creeping into her voice. "I think that's a really interesting way to frame it, Joy. Music has always been a business, but that doesn't diminish the message or the impact it can have. I've also done extensive work through my foundation supporting educational initiatives and disaster relief. Work that directly benefits communities regardless of whether they buy concert tickets or not." "Sure, philanthropy is great," Joy responded, her tone becoming more pointed. "But isn't there something a little ironic about singing about financial independence and women's empowerment while you're married to someone whose business practices have been, let's say, questionable at times? I mean, we're talking about streaming services that have been accused of not fairly compensating artists. Business ventures that some say exploit the very communities your music claims to uplift." The studio fell silent except for the hum of cameras and equipment. Beyoncé's expression remained controlled, but those who knew her could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. "I think you're conflating a lot of different issues here, Joy, and making some assumptions that aren't fair or accurate." Joy leaned back in her chair, clearly comfortable with the tension she had created. "I'm just asking the questions that I think a lot of people are thinking. You've built this image as this perfect feminist icon. But real feminism is messy. It's complicated. It involves making hard choices and sometimes admitting when you've made mistakes." "What mistakes would those be, exactly?" Beyoncé asked, her voice still measured, but with steel underneath. "Well, for starters, the way your team handles business, the lawsuits from former employees, the allegations about working conditions, the way smaller artists get pushed out when you collaborate with them. These aren't secrets, Beyoncé. They're documented issues that seem to contradict the empowerment message you're selling." The tension in the studio was palpable now. The other hosts looked uncomfortable, recognizing that this interview had veered far from the typical celebrity promotion into territory that felt more like an interrogation. Beyoncé took a deep breath, her hands clasped in her lap, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Joy, I came here to talk about my music and my art, not to defend myself against accusations that aren't based in fact. If you have specific concerns about business practices, Those are conversations for lawyers and business managers, not a daytime talk show. But that's exactly my point, Joy pressed on, seemingly energized by the pushback. You want to control the narrative. You want to talk about empowerment and strength, but only on your terms, only when it's convenient. Real leaders, real advocates for change, they don't get to pick and choose when they engage with difficult questions. Beyoncé's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I think there's a difference between difficult questions and an ambush designed to create controversy for television ratings. Joy's eyes lit up at Beyoncé's accusation, as if she had been waiting for exactly this moment. An ambush, really? So asking legitimate questions about public business practices is an ambush now? This is exactly what I'm talking about. Beyoncé, you want to be seen as this voice for the people, but the moment someone asks you to be accountable, you cry victim. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in an arena. Beyoncé's composure, which had been holding steady despite the mounting pressure, showed the first real crack. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a new intensity that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter. Victim, Joy? I've never played victim in my entire career. But what you're doing right now isn't journalism. It's a hit job disguised as an interview. You're taking rumors and speculation and presenting them as facts. And that's not just unprofessional. It's irresponsible. Joy leaned forward, clearly not backing down. Rumors? Let's talk about facts, then. Your company has been sued multiple times by former dancers and background vocalists who claim they weren't fairly compensated. That's not a rumor. That's court documents. Your merchandise is produced in facilities that labor advocates have raised concerns about. Again, documented. So, when exactly do we get to talk about these facts? Whoopi Goldberg, sensing the interview spiraling completely out of control, attempted to interject. Maybe we should take a step back here. And no, Whoopi, Beyoncé said, her attention laser focused on Joy. Let's finish this conversation. Joy, you want to talk about facts? Here's a fact. Every business deal I'm involved in goes through teams of lawyers and compliance experts. Every partnership is vetted. Every contract is reviewed. Are there sometimes disputes? Of course, that's the nature of business. But to suggest that I personally exploit people or communities is not just wrong. It's offensive. But you profit from systems that do, Joy shot back immediately. And that's the contradiction I'm pointing out. You can't sing about liberation while your business empire relies on the same structures that keep people down. You can't talk about supporting women while your legal teams spend millions fighting cases brought by women who worked for you. The other hosts exchanged increasingly worried glances. Sunny Hostin cleared her throat, trying to find an opening to redirect. Beyoncé, maybe you could tell us about your upcoming projects. Actually, Sunny, I think this conversation is revealing, Beyoncé interrupted, her voice gaining strength. It's showing exactly the kind of double standard that successful women, especially women of color, face every single day. Joy, when male artists have business disputes, do you question their entire moral foundation? When white executives make millions while their workers struggle, do you suggest they should stop talking about social issues? Joy's expression hardened. Don't make this about race, Beyoncé. That's a deflection tactic, and you know it. This is about accountability, something that should apply to everyone regardless of race or gender. Everything is about race, Joy, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, Beyoncé replied, her voice rising slightly for the first time. When you question my right to speak about social issues because of business complexities you don't even fully understand, when you suggest I'm somehow a hypocrite for navigating an industry that was built to exclude people like me, that's not colorblind accountability. That's holding me to standards you don't apply to others. Joy scoffed, a sound that seemed to echo through the studio. There it is, the race card. I knew we'd get there eventually. This is exactly why these conversations are so difficult. The moment someone asks tough questions, it becomes about race instead of about behavior. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Beyoncé's face went through a transformation that anyone who had watched her career could recognize. The shift from gracious superstar to someone who had reached her absolute limit. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried the kind of authority that had commanded stadiums full of people. Joy, let me be very clear about something. What you just said, dismissing legitimate concerns about racial bias as playing the race card, tells me everything I need to know about who you are and what this conversation is really about. You didn't invite me here to have a discussion. You invited me here to tear me down, and you're using coded language and false equivalencies to do it. False equivalencies? Joy's voice pitched higher. I'm asking you the same questions I'd ask any public figure who preaches one thing and does another. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should examine why. You want to know what makes me uncomfortable? Beyoncé asked, her posture shifting as she leaned forward in her chair. What makes me uncomfortable is sitting across from someone who thinks she can lecture me about authenticity and accountability while she sits in a position she's held for decades, making millions, and using that platform to attack women who have had to fight for everything they've achieved. The studio fell into a stunned silence. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Joy's mouth opened slightly, as if she was going to respond. But for perhaps the first time in her television career, she seemed momentarily speechless. Beyoncé continued, her voice gaining momentum. You want to talk about hypocrisy, Joy? Let's talk about how you've built a career on being controversial, on saying provocative things for ratings, and then you sit here and question my integrity. You've never built anything, never created jobs for thousands of people, never used your platform to actually change lives in measurable ways, but you feel qualified to judge those who have. Joy found her voice again, but it carried a defensive edge. Now I've been a voice for progressive causes for decades, Beyoncé. I've used this platform to fight for women's rights, for social justice. No, Joy, Beyoncé cut her off, her tone decisive. You've used this platform to perform progressiveness. There's a difference between actually doing the work and talking about the work for television cameras. Joy's face flushed red at the accusation, her composure completely cracking for the first time. Performing progressiveness? Are you kidding me? I've been fighting battles you probably don't even know existed before you were born. I was talking about women's rights when you were still learning dance moves. The condescension in those words seemed to electrify the air. Beyoncé's eyes flashed with something dangerous. And when she spoke, her voice carried a controlled fury that was somehow more intimidating than shouting would have been. There it is, Joy. The real you. Age, experience, all the classic weapons used to dismiss younger women, especially younger Black women. You think because you've been on television longer, it gives you the right to minimize what I've accomplished, to question my authenticity while you sit there throwing around tired stereotypes. The other hosts looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. Sarah Haynes made a weak attempt to intervene. Maybe we could all just take a breath here. And no, Sarah, Beyoncé said without taking her eyes off Joy. I think it's important that people see this, that they see exactly how some women tear down other women while claiming to champion women's causes. Joy, you want to know what real feminism looks like? Real feminism doesn't involve older white women lecturing younger Black women about how to be authentic or accountable. Joy's voice cracked with indignation. I can't believe you're making this about age and race instead of addressing the actual issues I've raised. This is exactly the kind of deflection that prevents real progress. What issues, Joy? Beyoncé's voice rose again, her control starting to slip. You haven't raised issues. You've thrown around accusations without evidence, made assumptions about my business practices without facts. And when I push back, you dismiss it as playing cards. That's not raising issues. That's character assassination. Character assassination. Joy laughed, but it was a harsh sound without any humor. You're one of the most powerful women in entertainment. You have teams of publicists and lawyers protecting your image. I'm one person asking questions that the media is too scared to ask because of exactly this kind of reaction. Scared, Beyoncé repeated, and something in her tone made everyone lean back slightly. Joy, the media isn't scared of me. They're professional. They do their research. They ask informed questions. They don't ambush guests with conspiracy theories and call it journalism. What you're doing isn't brave. It's desperate. The word desperate seemed to hit Joy like a physical blow. Her face went through several expressions before settling on something between rage and wounded pride. Desperate? I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I don't need to be desperate about anything. Then why are you trying so hard to tear me down on national television? Beyoncé asked, leaning forward. Why are you so invested in proving that I'm somehow fake or hypocritical? What does my success take away from you that you need to attack it so viciously? Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Beyoncé wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened and years of dealing with similar attacks seemed to pour out all at once. Do you know what I think, Joy? I think you're uncomfortable with women who don't fit into the boxes. You understand? I think you're threatened by success that doesn't look like yours, by influence that doesn't operate the way yours does. And instead of examining that discomfort, you've decided to make it my problem. That's ridiculous, Joy sputtered. But her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Beyoncé challenged. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a woman who has spent decades as one of the few female voices in a male-dominated industry. And now that there are other women with platforms and power, you don't know how to share that space. So, you attack instead of support. You tear down instead of build up. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Even the production staff behind the cameras had gone still, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Joy's voice, when she finally found it, was shaky with anger. You don't know anything about my struggles or my contributions. You don't get to sit there and psychoanalyze me because I asked you hard questions. Hard questions. Beyoncé's laugh was sharp. Joy, you haven't asked me a single hard question. You've made accusations, spread innuendo, and attacked my character. If you want to ask hard questions, ask about the creative process. Ask about balancing artistry with commerce. Ask about the challenges of staying authentic in an industry built on image. Those are hard questions. What you did was a hatchet job. Joy stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. The movement was so abrupt that it seemed to startle everyone, including herself. I don't have to sit here and be lectured by someone who thinks her celebrity makes her above criticism. Beyoncé looked up at Joy with an expression that somehow managed to be both pitying and furious. No one said, "I'm above criticism, Joy." But criticism requires facts, fairness, and good faith. You've shown none of those things today. You've shown exactly why some people don't trust the media. Why they think journalists have agendas instead of integrity. Journalists? Joy's voice cracked. I'm not a journalist. I'm a talk show host. This isn't the evening news. It's daytime television. The admission seemed to hang in the air like a confession. Beyoncé's expression shifted to something approaching disbelief. So you admit it. You admit that you were never trying to have a real conversation or ask legitimate questions. You were performing for television, creating drama for ratings, using my reputation as entertainment. Joy seemed to realize what she had just admitted, and her face went pale. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is, Beyoncé said quietly, standing up from her own chair. It's exactly what you meant. And it's exactly what this was. And you know what, Joy? That's the most honest thing you've said all day. The silence that followed Beyoncé's words was deafening. Joy stood frozen, seemingly realizing that her admission had stripped away any pretense of legitimacy from everything that had come before. The other hosts looked like they were watching a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away, but knowing they were witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond this single interview. Beyoncé reached down and unclipped her microphone with deliberate, measured movements. Each action seemed to carry weight, as if she was making a statement with every gesture. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, but it carried the kind of finality that made it clear this conversation was over. Joy, I've spent my entire career being professional, being gracious, taking the high road, even when people didn't deserve it. But what you did today crossed every line of basic respect and decency. You used your platform to attack me personally, to spread unfounded accusations, and to try to diminish everything I've worked for, all for the sake of television drama. Joy tried to interject, her voice desperate now. Beyoncé, that wasn't my intention. I was just trying to. No, Beyoncé cut her off, her hand raised to stop the words. You don't get to backtrack now. You don't get to claim good intentions after you've shown your true colors. What you intended was to create controversy at my expense, to use my name and reputation to generate buzz for your show. And you know what the saddest part is? You could have had a real conversation. You could have asked about my music, my creative process, my actual work. Instead, you chose this. Whoopi Goldberg made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Beyoncé, please. Maybe we can just reset here. And Beyoncé turned to look at Whoopi, and her expression softened slightly, showing respect for someone she clearly viewed differently than Joy. Whoopi, I have tremendous respect for you and what you've accomplished, but I can't sit here and pretend that what just happened was acceptable. I can't normalize the idea that it's okay to ambush guests with personal attacks and call it entertainment. She turned back to Joy, who was still standing but looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of what had transpired was physically pressing down on her. Joy, you want to know about accountability? Here's some accountability for you. You owe your viewers better than this. You owe your guests better than this, and you owe yourself better than this. Joy's voice was barely above a whisper. I was just doing my job. No, Beyoncé replied, shaking her head. Your job is to inform, to entertain, to facilitate conversations that matter. Your job isn't to tear people down for sport, and if you think it is, then maybe you need to reconsider what business you're really in. The studio seemed to hold its breath as Beyoncé gathered her composure, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to leave. But she wasn't finished. She turned to face the cameras directly, addressing the audience that had been watching this entire exchange unfold. To everyone who's been watching this, I want you to understand something. What happened here today is exactly why it's so important to think critically about the media you consume. Not everything that looks like journalism is journalism. Not every question that gets asked deserves an answer. And not every controversy that gets manufactured is worth your attention. She paused, letting those words sink in before continuing. I came here to talk about music, about art, about the things that actually matter. Instead, I was subjected to a character assassination disguised as an interview. And while I'm disappointed in how this went, I'm not surprised. This is what happens when ratings matter more than responsibility. When entertainment matters more than truth. Joy finally found her voice again, but it was weak and defensive. Beyoncé, you're being dramatic. This is how interviews work sometimes. They get heated. They get intense. Beyoncé's laugh was short and sharp. Joy, this isn't how interviews work. This is how ambushes work. This is how you destroy trust between media and the people they're supposed to serve. And the fact that you still don't understand the difference tells me everything I need to know. She turned away from Joy completely now, focusing her attention on the other hosts and the cameras. To Whoopi, Sunny, Sarah, Anna, I'm sorry that you had to be part of this. You're better than this show was today. With that, Beyoncé began walking toward the exit, her movement triggering a flurry of activity from production staff, who clearly had no protocol for handling a guest departure mid-show. The cameras followed her, capturing every step of what was becoming one of the most talked-about moments in daytime television history. But she wasn't done yet. Just before reaching the studio door, Beyoncé turned back one final time. Her voice, when she spoke, carried across the entire studio with crystal clarity. Joy, I hope someday you understand that tearing other women down doesn't build you up. I hope you learn that controversy isn't the same thing as relevance. And I hope that the next time you have the privilege of interviewing someone, you remember that there's a human being sitting across from you, not just content for your show. The studio door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow seemed to echo like thunder. Joy stood in the middle of the set, looking around at her co-hosts, at the cameras, at the production staff, all of whom were staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to disappointment to something approaching disgust. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Whoopi finally spoke, her voice heavy with exhaustion and embarrassment. Well, that certainly wasn't what we had planned for today. Joy slumped back into her chair, seeming to age years in the span of seconds. The fight had gone out of her completely, leaving behind someone who looked smaller, more vulnerable, and perhaps for the first time genuinely remorseful. But it was too late. The damage was done. The words were spoken, and the cameras had captured every moment. What was supposed to be a routine celebrity interview had become a masterclass in how not to conduct yourself as a media professional, and everyone in that studio knew it. The aftermath would be swift and merciless, but that's a story for another day. What mattered in that moment was that viewers had witnessed something unprecedented. A moment when a superstar refused to play along with the game, refused to accept treatment that was beneath her dignity, and walked away on her own terms. So, what do you think? Was Beyoncé right to walk away from the interview? Or should she have stayed and continued the conversation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the moments that had everyone